at this time, I'm going to introduce Mr. Lloyd Graham from Moat Casey. He is their representative here tonight that will assist with our Zoom meeting, and with Miss Amber, who's an attorney from who's an attorney from Moat Casey, and then she's going to run us through the legislative update. But here's Lloyd Graham.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for receiving us in your school. So, buenas noches, damas y caballeros. Gracias por recibirnos en su escuela, donde entendemos cada cabeza es un mundo. New Valley, where we understand every head is a world of its own, every child is a genius, and I know that because this is not my first time here. And we have some folks from our offices that work with y'all and work closely with your administration, and we're privileged every time we do. Y'all are a wonderful, caring place. And I'm not class of 75, I'm class of 74. I graduated from Uvalde in 1974, but it wasn't Uvalde, but it was Belleville over in Austin County, and it was a strong, independent, agrarian-based community and county seat where our roots ran deep and we held on tight to the people we love. And I see that every time I come here. So thank you for having us. This is my friend, Amber Lasang, and Amber has a terminal degree, but it's not in law, okay? And not today, maybe so, huh? But Amber is absolutely a school finance expert. She's been practicing. I won't tell you how many years she's been practicing because you can look at her and understand that she doesn't look old enough to have done that. But she's going to make a presentation. We'll both field questions. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn so that I may see y'all. And at any point in time you want to stop, this is your meeting. You're investing your time. And so we are here to help any way we can. So as we roll, you've heard this always, the only foolish question is the one you don't ask. So I'm not Mr. Graham, I'm not Dr. Graham, I'm just Lloyd, if you don't mind. I spent 25 years in the superintendency, 33 years in school, and I tell everybody, please call me Lloyd, please call me Papa. It doesn't make me any difference, okay? But I set everything else aside. So without further ado, well, there's a little further ado. I want to give you a setup for school finance for just a second, and Amber will touch on it. HB 3 2019, she's going to talk to you about basic allotment. And let's just talk about the amount of money that there is for one child that shows up at school, not enrolled, but that shows up. The child's not present, funding's lost. It was $6,160 per child. If we take that number today and we use the Comptroller of Public Account of Texas, not some Washington, D.C. number, not some think tank out of Harvard, but we use our Comptroller of Public Accounts in Texas's Consumer Price Index for inflation, and we adjust that number for inflation, then that number would have to be $7,500 today just to break even. And so that's $1,340 difference. $1,300 sounds to me like it's over 20% of $6,160. We're probably right at. And so to begin with, today, the district is having to function on 80% of the basic money that it had to function with headed into 1920. And I think that's an important construct for us to get our mind around. At any point in time that she wants to disagree with me, I know Amber well enough to know she'll shut me down and do that. But Amber, with your permission, I'm gonna let you have it, and I'm gonna turn this microphone off.
Hi, y'all. Thank you for letting me stay home in the cold. I'm based out of Dallas. I have worked, Lloyd didn't tell you, but I've been in public schools for about 20 years. I have worked in some strange places. I've worked in State Department, I've worked in an ESC, and I've only worked in large districts. But I'm from a small rural community in Michigan, so I deeply understand how important the public school is to a community. Ms. Colas, I have to answer your question. So I was thinking about, I love public school. I think I was a public school advocate when I was in kindergarten, but I had a teacher my junior and senior year of high school. I was bad and I waited to take typing. Remember when we taught typing? Till my junior and senior year. And she made us do Microsoft Office, which was revolutionary at the time. but she made us do our math homework in Excel. And so I had to do trigonometry homework in Excel. And, nothing's been harder since then, because trying to work all those little parentheses in an Excel workbook around a trig formula, you know what, school finance, it's complicated. But if you liken it to what you have at home, you've got your spending money, you've got your savings, and this is how we all work. So the system in Texas is large and complex. There is no denying that. I went through your slides from the other night, and you talked about it, right? You've had to make a lot of sacrifices in your district because of it's hard to say cuts because the state will disagree with us. But like Mr. Graham said, when inflation is at the rate that it's been in, which you feel in your personal pocketbook, right? When you go to the grocery store, when you pay your light bill, when you try to get a loan, everything is more expensive than it was in 2018, 2019. So the facts are the facts. I left the district that I left just closed 5 elementaries up here to maintain what they're doing. So it's really hard in our current system because the state will tell you they haven't made cuts, but in an inflationary situation like we've been in the last 5 years, not adding is making a cut, right? So I'm just going to level set with that. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. I don't like that I can't see you. So if I'm going too fast, if you have something you need to interrupt, I don't mind an interruption. And just so you know, my maiden name was Krykowski. My married name is Lasang. I have always gone by Amber. Just call me Amber. I've never been able to get anyone to call me by my last name because I've always had one that nobody could pronounce. So interrupt me. It won't bother me. We can turn off the camera. I can turn off the slides and we can talk. And if there's anything that you need me to repeat or you want me to spend more time on that I missed, feel free to interrupt me. Won't bother me in the least. All right. So I'm going to do a basic school finance 101 for the state of Texas. It's big and long and complicated, right? So what we live by, what you'll hear us talk about is the Foundation School Program, which is the method in which how Texas schools are funded. And really, it's just a combination of your local tax dollars and the money the state kicks in to run schools in the state of Texas. In 23-24, you'll see it's a little more than half is local tax collections, but it's $38 billion in local tax collections, $30 billion in state aid, makes up the almost $69 billion that it takes to run Texas public schools. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about federal funds in this presentation. Those normally flow outside of the Foundation School Program, but because of the money we got under ESSER, we see a big spike in revenue for a couple years. So I just want to mention that. But really, the Foundation School Program, so you'll hear me say FSP, that's what I mean. And that's the holistic point of school funding. So there's the Maintenance and Operations Fund, which I know y'all saw that a little bit last week, and then the Interest and Sinking Fund. I hid the slides on your INS fund. I had done some of those when I looked at your presentation from last week. You don't have a Interest and Sinking Fund amount this year, so we're just going to glaze over those, but that's how you pay off your long-term debt. So Maintenance and operations. So you'll hear people talk about the M&O tax rate. That's the one that's the larger part of your bill, and it's made up of 2 pieces: the tier 1 tax rate, and which is the absolute bottom amount that we can pay. This is state mandated. And then tier 2 are the enrichment pennies. So when the TRE in your district didn't pass, that was to increase your tier 2. Tier 2 used to be formerly known as the enrichment pennies. But as we've talked about, funding has gotten so tight. Tier 1 was to run a basic school program. So theoretically, you could run school without tier 2. What we know is that's not true. So tier 2 are the additional pennies that you can take on locally, and it's up to the 17 cents. And right now y'all have 8, but we'll get into that in a while. So how does FSP work? It's not as simple as it looks on the screen. Each one of these is very long and complex, but we're going to break it down in these kind of simple categories. So the first thing you do is calculate your entitlement, and we're going to go deep into that. And then you apply your local share. Applying the local share is actually probably the easiest step, because it's basically how much the state thinks you need to kick in based on your tax rate and your local property values. So basically, y'all tax at the rate allowed, your compressed rate plus your tier 2 pennies. You collect those and you say to the state, here's the money. And the state goes, yes, you've collected enough. And then they fill the rest of your bucket. So step 1 is the most important part for you all, and it's the most complex. So we're going to walk through that a little bit. I'm not going to go as deep, but if you have very specific questions, like I said, feel free to stop me, because I'll be happy to go over them. Oops, sorry, y'all. I hit the button. So calculating your entitlement. So this is where it's very complex. So when we calculate our entitlement, and this is one of the funny things I think about Texas public school finance, is there's a lovely man named Omar who used to work at TEA who has come up with a revenue projection template. Everybody in the state uses it. He's long since retired from TEA. He works for a company out of Oklahoma now, but he still runs this, and it's called the Omar template. So if you're ever really stressed out and need to like fall asleep at night, Google the Omar template and download it and just start playing with it. And you'll be very grateful for your school finance staff and your superintendent that they know all this. So there's 20 different allotments, and they're based on your student attendance, student characteristics, and district characteristics. So when we talk about ADA, the average daily attendance, so when Mr. Graham said you get $6,160 for your generic run-of-the-mill student, so your average kiddo can get that much. Well, that's only if they attend every day. So that average daily attendance piece is so important. And then there's student characteristics, such as, are you special ed? Are you in CTE? Are you a gifted student? And we'll go through these a little bit more. And then there's the district. Is it rural? Is it not? There's your tax rate, how much you're collecting, and your debt service. So there's all these pieces that go into calculating your entitlement. So, like I said, average daily attendance is always what we're going to focus on first. So ADA for 23-24 for your district was 3,321. So that was your average daily attendance. However, your enrollment was 4,036. So there's a big gap, right? So when people hear, and it's really hard for people to understand when you talk about ADA, because you don't fund programs on ADA, but the school is funded on ADA. You don't fund a classroom with 2/3 of a teacher or a 90% of a teacher, right? So this is one of those things that TEA or the legislature in their infinite wisdom thinks that by having ADA, it compels districts to work harder to have students attend. Now, theoretically, that's one of those things that you can kind of go up and down since COVID, because we don't want sick kids at school. We don't want kids who need, it's kind of a broken thing. So you don't really want 100% attendance for every kid every day. If your school is anything like my school up here, my poor kiddo's been sick for the last 6, because we had the flu and we had RSV and you want kids to stay home and get well, right? So ADA is a little bit of a dicey concept. And so then you go, some things are funded on straight count. So state comp ed, which is your program for students who, they call them educationally disadvantaged, but basically they live in a community with a low economic status, right? And they're based on community status. It's not actually based on individual kids. And then the college and career military readiness outcomes bonus, that's a count. Dyslexia allotment, how many students in your district have dyslexia? So then you're just straight, it's almost enrollment. Like, how many of these do you have? Check. And then there's another complicated feature called student FTE. And that's how much time your student is in that program. So it really is generally only for special education and CTE. So if you think about it, I have a kiddo who's going to a career and technical program. They have an ADA. Well, on top of that, they're in CTE 2 of the 6 hours of the day. So those all match together. So this is when the the allotments get really complicated because, and this is why it's really hard for CFOs. You don't know the data until after the first, because it's by 6 weeks. So what was your average daily attendance in the first 6 weeks, in the second 6 weeks? So you don't even know until the end of May what your full ADA was for the year, right? So that's why it's so complicated for us to do revenue projections, because we start school in August and cannot, no way to know until the end of the school year what our revenue will be. When we talk about the basic allotment, and keep that number in your head, $6,160 per student per year at 100% attendance. When we adjust to the basic allotment, and you'll hear us say we would advocate for this over everything, I would. Maybe other people have different opinions, but this is a good example where a rising tide lifts all boats, because many of our allotments, those 20 allotments we talked about, are adjusted based on the basic allotment. So the regular program allotment, that's just your everyday generic education. That's ADA times the basic allotment. So if the basic allotment goes up, that's more money for regular programs. And I use this slide because I want to go over the individual allotments and then also talk about the basic allotment. So I'm going to read these, but I think it's important to know how many different pieces of the formula there are. And that's why when someone will ask you, you can't just sit down with a pen and paper and do the school finance formula. You actually have to have all these resources in front of you. So then there's compensatory education allotment, which those are based on, that's based on 15 at this point at-risk indicators. It could be your low income, it could be your bilingual, it could be that you're pregnant and parenting. There's a million, you're going to JJAEP, you're part of the foster care system. That's a really broad allotment, and it's meant to help students who could struggle to not graduate on time. And then special ed, and the special ed allotment is a complex formula on top of itself. So in the education allotment, there's another 10 mini allotments. So if you're a homebound student receiving services from the school, you would have a different allotment than a student who is mainstream, who just needs some additional support. So those numbers all interact differently together. Then career and technology also is one that has multiple allotments. So if you're a younger student and you're just learning the basics, it's not as high. But if you're a student who's really engaged in CTE and taking, 90 minutes every other day, it could be a nice weightier formula. CTE is one of the best well-funded allotments in the state. It's one where actually districts struggle to spend the full allotment as a general rule. So that one is probably the best funded allotment in the state. And then the small and mid-size allotment, that's based on the size of your district, and it's weighted. The smaller you are, the more you get, because it's based on the idea that there's economies of scale. A district whose 5,000 students can have less central office support than a district that's 200 students, because you still need a superintendent, you still need a CFO, there's a few things you have to have. You still have to have someone doing HR, hiring, payroll. Those things have to happen no matter what size you are. So that's supposed to balance the scales a little bit. The early education allotment is based on K through 3 enrollment of students who are low income and bilingual. And that's really the purpose of that one, was meant to fund the other half of full day pre-K. That passed under House Bill 3, so that's a newer one. Bilingual educational allotment, that is for students who are English language learners. So their home language is not English, whether they come in there speaking Farsi or Spanish or whatever. When they come to school, their home language is not English. Transportation is based on the number of miles at a reimbursement rate. There's not anybody in the state of Texas who will tell you that the transportation allotment is enough, because the current allotment for regular mileage is $1 a mile. And we all know that's not enough. So that one's a pretty easy one. You won't get argument from anyone that that's well funded. The fast growth allotment, this is very much just based, Uvalde wouldn't count. There's not a lot of, so if you think of the districts who are really fast growing, they have to open schools and hire teachers, there's a little bit of extra weight there. There's the CCMR outcomes bonuses. That's for our students who are graduating based on TEA's formulas, college, career, or military ready. So basically the thought is they're graduating from high school ready for their next step. right? So are they going into the military? Great. They can pass the ASVAB. They're going to enroll, enlist in the military. 6 months later, they're still in. They're college ready. So they are enrolling in college and they're staying in college. And then the other one is career. So those CTE programs, if you have cosmetology or welding or all these wonderful programs our districts across the state offer, culinary arts, these things that are really high need, kids are graduating, they're going straight to work, and everybody is proud of those programs. Then dyslexia is a newer one as well. That's the one I said actually is COUNT. It's not an ABA weighted program, sorry. So students who are identified as dyslexic and receiving services. So a lot of times you can graduate out of, so you're identified as dyslexia, but you're no longer receiving services. So only the students receiving services get funded. Gifted and talented is limited at 10% of your enrollment, no matter what happens. So most districts are very underfunded in gifted and talented. NIFA, if you open a brand new building, TEA or the state does have some funding for that. It's always prorated. It's never funded at a high enough amount. So I think it's supposed to be $1,000 per student. However, the last time I applied, I think we got like 850, and I'm sure that changes. I know it changes every year. The teacher incentive allotment, if your district has gone through the process to get approved, teachers can get an additional pay based on their merit and their evaluations annually, but they have to be given to the state and tracked that way. So the state funds that directly. Your district would just get a line item of revenue, and that pretty much goes to a teacher. School safety allotment is wildly underfunded, and we'll talk about that. So in the last legislative session, one thing that did happen is they funded school safety at $10 per student plus $15,000 per campus. That's one that probably will see some change in the next session. And then college prep and certification reimbursement. So those are, if your kids take certification exams, the state will reimburse you for those. So it's not really revenue, but it's not expense either. So if you pay $45 for a kiddo to take a Microsoft certification, the state will give you that $45 back. So it's a little bit in and out. It doesn't, if you don't do the activity, you don't get the money. So it's kind of one-to-one. So then we apply the local share. So like I said, the first step the state's going to do is say, what is your tax rate? Did you collect enough money? And then if so, we'll fill the rest of your bucket. So this is when you'll start to hear about recapture or property poor and property wealthy districts. So if you're a property wealthy district, your taxes cover more than your bucket needs, and you have to pay that back. If you are property, average to property poor, your district, your local taxes don't fill up the bucket and the state fills it in. So that's where the concept of Robin Hood is. And this is one where you'll hear people talk about if you raise the basic allotment, people pay less recapture because when the bucket overall gets bigger, we get to keep more of our money, right? So, one piece that's different here is charter schools are entirely state funded. They don't have a local share. So that's important to note. And when people get frustrated about charters, that's one of the reasons they don't have a local tax base. So they would never pay recapture because they're only funded on what they get. And it's all state funded. So it's a little bit different, that whole process. So specifically related to Uvalde, when I was doing research, your current tier 1 rate, that's the rate the state sets, right? That's based on your property value growth annually. You're at the floor. So, and then you've got all 8 golden pennies. The golden pennies are called golden pennies because they have a higher value and you don't pay recapture no matter what. So if you're a very property wealthy district, so this is one that used to be called the Austin yield because it used to be based on Austin. Austin is the highest land value in the community, in the state. So no matter how much they collect for those 8 pennies, they get to keep. So there are districts around the state, we call them internally platinum pennies because their property is so valuable that's really a wonderful thing. They get to keep the resources. And then you don't have the copper pennies. Copper pennies are called copper pennies. There are more of them, but they have a lower yield and they are subject to recapture. So if you're a recapture district, a lot of recapture districts will shy away from adopting copper pennies because it doesn't behoove them to collect them. Now, I worked with a district this year who went and for the last 3 pennies because it was worth it. Even though they only got to keep a very small amount of them. So that's how our tax rate looks. The tier 1 tax rate before House Bill 3 was $1. So everyone kind of kept it as $1 and the max tax rate was $1.17. Every year now, based on your local property values, that compresses down. That's part of state law. So now yours is 61.69. So think about that. That's almost a 40% drop since 2019. It's a huge decrease, but property values are growing so fast, people haven't really been able to absorb and feel that. So that's why the last 2 sessions and this session as well, there's a big focus on compressing the tax rate or increasing the homestead exemption to decrease the taxable value on a local citizen for your home. So then, okay, your bucket's 2/3 full. The rest gets filled with state aid. State aid is just state money. So there's a million, really the main primary way the state fills our bucket is with state sales tax. But there's also business severance taxes. There's also the lotto. Everyone talks about the lotto in public school because it never was enough to cover it, but we really wanted it to. So anything that you don't collect in taxes is going to be filled with state aid. I didn't mention earlier when I was looking at y'all's data, the last few years, you're at about 99% tax collections. So you're basically 100% filling your bucket with your local share. So TEA is going to go ahead and fill your state aid all the way. Districts that don't collect enough taxes actually don't get all their state aid. TEA and the state funding formulas punish them for not collecting enough, which is one of those pieces of the funding formula I don't understand because we can tax, but we can't force collections. So that's just one of those things that doesn't make the most sense to me. And then for y'all's data, I did a high level. I don't live in your community. I don't see your data every day. So this is an Amber projection. I don't write it down as what you're for sure getting. Cause like I said, you won't even know what you're getting for 24-25 until that last 6 weeks. And you know your data so much better than me. But this is just a high level overview of like, if I just came in and did a quick look, what I think revenue would look for your district. There's some key things you need to have. One, you need to have all that ADA data. You need to have all those student characteristic datas, and then you need to know what's happening every 6 weeks with your attendance, right? So for 24-25, I took your 23-24 data. I used projections and saw there was a small decrease in enrollment, so I assumed that. I held special population stagnant because while enrollment is decreasing, special ed is increasing across. People are really working hard to increase CTE, things like that. The only thing I changed is in the budget today, it came out, so I quick reran your budget, is in 25-26, the golden penny yield is increasing according to statutory law. So I ran that number again and fixed that. So you need to know your student factors. You need to know your property value, what's happening. Last year from 23 to 24, property value grew 9%. I assumed that same growth for next year. Who knows? That's always going to be, we don't find out until April. It's finalized in July, and then it's refinalized the next February. So that's one that we're always chasing. That's a data point that schools are always chasing. And then I assume that same 99% tax collections, because that doesn't tend to waver much. Like if you have a really high paying tax base, they tend to keep being high paying unless something economic happens. And then we don't know so much for 25-26, right? The state, both the House and the Senate released their budgets today. I've got some highlights in the next section of that. Will there be a change in the basic allotment? We think, but maybe we don't know, right? Remember last session had 4 special sessions because we all fought. So we don't know. We expect there'll be a change in school safety funding. We expect there'll be some adjustment to special ed funding. There's been a really big push over the last 2 bienniums because we know special ed is underfunded, and the funding weights for special ed actually passed in like the mid 80s. So the weights aren't even accurate. We all were just doing the best we could, right? So that whole how special ed is funded in Texas isn't working. And I think everybody from the governor to the lieutenant governor to the House, everybody knows it doesn't work. So the system is actually working together, and TEA is really working with us to create a new system. So there's a lot of unknowns for next year. So we're just going to take this for the back of the napkin math that it probably is. So for 24-25, you've got your local share. I put that in orange of 11.5 million. And then you've got your state aid to fill that bucket, right? So if you think about how your bucket's filled, about a third of it is in local share. The next 2/3 is your foundation school program and the available school fund. The available school fund is a little bit different. It counts as state aid, but that's part of how Texas funded public schools at the very beginning of time. So that one will always be there. It will always be small because it's an annuity program. So if you look, my estimate for this year, it could be vastly incorrect, but this is just my estimate, is $36.3 million. And then next year, the major change is really where we closed the gap because of that increase in the golden penny yield, because I assumed a 1% decline in attendance, or not attendance, in enrollment, which led to a little bit of a decline. So state aid is kind of level, but available school fund, that number will adjust, but we don't know the WADA rate, and we won't know it until probably June. So part of it is these numbers, when you're working with your local school district, is it's really hard to project revenue in a biennium year, because we don't know what the legislature is going to do. Everything is behind. So I always, working in a school district, it was always hope and pray. And then now working with districts across the state, it's hope and pray. So it's a little bit, I'm guessing at this point, I would work with the 36.2. If you get more, yay. I don't think you'll get less, right? So you always want to come from a conservative point of view and then fill the bucket if there's anything else. So any questions before I move on to what do we think the legislature is going to do?
The only thing I know for certain about legislative sessions is I was always told you never know who your children will marry, and you'll never know how a legislator will vote. So I believe that that's true and where we're headed. But as a practicing superintendent, I can tell you that they will benchmark you if they choose to off the last year of the preceding biennium. Remember that, meaning that they're not going to let you have a windfall. They're going to benchmark back to your prior year tax rate. And so whereas we are hopeful that there will be some money available to us, and she will speak to that, and she has spoken to that, but we have no crystal ball, I don't think there's any kind of windfall coming. Any questions for Amber where we are right now? She asked for them. Ms. Lasang, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So if we reverse time, which in my world, I feel like there's like pre-COVID and post-COVID, I feel like the world kind of went upside down. In 2019, Texas passed House Bill 3, which made a significant improvement in funding. I mean, I was watching the lieutenant governor and the speaker and the governor speak that day, and I was so excited because they were saving our bacon. And then COVID happened and inflation happened, and our bacon is gone now. So inflation is largely, this data I'm showing you is from the Legislative Budget Board. So this is the legislature's data points. These aren't ours. And I think that's important. So this red line shows these are constant dollars, this little blocked line. So even the legislature and the LBB, even the legislature knows that we have less money than we did in 2019. Like, they fully acknowledge it because of inflation. So this red line is where we were funded in 2019. So starting in 22, we're actually getting less, and the state knows it. But the issue is this data is kind of misleading because it doesn't really tell the whole story. So as you can see, I think one important thing is average daily attendance. We saw a little dip in COVID, like you would expect, right? So in 20, it went up a little bit, and then we saw this little dink down, but it's not a huge dink down. And then so our average daily attendance runs about 93-94% a year. That's pretty good. But however, this huge block right here, I want you to pay attention to this. This is that enormous influx of federal funds we had. So you can see the little gray bar at the top tends to be pretty stagnant, right? Like, it tends to be the same size. And that includes like Title I. So the low income funding, special ed, career and tech, we get a little bit of money from the feds for all those things. This year, we got this huge amount So that terminal degree Mr. Lloyd referred to, that's what I studied, was ESSER funding, and how it impacted the schools across the state. So we spent a lot of money on stuff and a lot of money on staff, and then now we're all living it, right? So then the other thing it doesn't show is $4 billion here wasn't actually ever given it to us. So in the last biennium, when we were fighting with our state legislators over vouchers, they appropriated to us $4 billion each year. However, they never gave it to us because vouchers didn't pass. So this white bar here is overstated by about $4 billion each year. So even their own data is a little distorted, but then you look at the holding for inflation. So if you look at what we had and how, so this is kind of what the basic allotment did. If you just dollars per student, when you take all the dollars, right, inflation adjusted dollars, look at what happened in 1920. We saw this nice spike. Well, then we just see this tanking. So if you look, we're actually living on less real money than we had in 2015, 2016. And if you go back, if you want to think about this long path we've been on in public school, in 2010, 2011, we had a major recession and they cut all of our funding. We've never gotten back to where we were in 2010, 2011. So that's this is the state of affairs currently. So there is hope. There is not hope we're going to get to here. Like I don't in any universe think we're going to get what inflation says we should have. So bill filing has begun. It begins in November. Before the session even started, there was 2,000 bills filed. As of this morning, there was 22,754. So I said more than 2,750 have been filed. And so that's of everything. Moat Casey is tracking nearly 600 bills that impact public education in some ways. A lot of those have to do with property tax relief. So even though they're public education related, they're much more property tax relief. And then we've heard that there's almost 20,000 bills in the pipeline. So the ledge has to get a lot done in a very short time period. So the 89th, who are our key players? We have our new Speaker Burrows. If you've paid attention, there was a little bit of a frustration from our Republican leadership that Cook was not chosen. And so what will happen is now the Speaker gets to announce committee chairs. So we don't have committee set up for the House yet because we're so far behind. But in the House, there's 35 new members. One thing that's of note is they asked to save 150 bill numbers for priorities. So the priority bills are the ones they want. So they want a lower number bill. So like the appropriations bill is Senate Bill 1. It is, so it's the most important thing. It's the thing they have to do every session. So the lower the number, technically the higher the priority is if you ever looking at bills. House Bill 3 in the 2019 session was school finance reform. House Bill 3 last session was school safety. So the lower the number, the higher the importance, according to our system. And right now, House Republicans have set aside a goal of $20 billion in property tax cuts. In the bills that came out today, we'll look at they came out higher. So Governor Abbott will announce in his state of his state the emergency items. We won't know till the first week of February. And those are the priorities for the whole state. And so educational freedom, vouchers, education savings account, whatever you want to call it, that's still one of his priorities. And he's the one that has the authority to call the special sessions. So all 4 special sessions that we went through last time, he gets to call them. That's his job. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, as you know, he leads the Senate. There's only 2 new senators. He only asked for 40 bills for reserve priorities, so their priority list is a little bit smaller. The issue is, though, he endorsed Representative Cook in the speaker race. So you've got a little bit of headbutting. We'll have a little bit of legislative jockeying. Just the way things work out, because he didn't back the speaker. Right. So he has been out there saying that it's a Democratic speaker instead of a Republican speaker because he Burrows leaned on the Democratic side of the House to get his speakership. So we're going to have a little bit of Texas politics happening. So yeah, I'm just kind of, what we're up against. So the Texas House is split. In the 88th legislature, they had 64 Democrats and 86 Republicans. We had a little bit of a shift, not much, to 62 and 88. So we've got a little bit of a shift. But we've got some more far right and some more far left. So there's room for a little bit of, we'll see what happens legislatively, right? Nobody has a crystal ball. It's a game I like to play, but a game I never win. So we don't know what the committee is going to look like for education because they just announced a speaker. We won't know probably for another 2 or 3 weeks what the education committee looks like. So this is what it was last time. Mr. Allison and Mr. Schaefer are no longer in the House. So for sure they'll be gone. So there'll be definitely some shifts. The Senate also shifted a little bit more Republican. We had 12 Democrats and 19 Republicans last time. This time we have 11 Democrats and 20 Republicans, so there's more of a shift, but not much of a change, right? And then here's your new Committee on Education. So Senator Creighton, he's the chair. Senator Campbell, she's the vice chair. That's not a change. There's a couple new members here. So Phil King's a new member, Mays Middleton, but there's just a couple new members. So the Senate Committee on Education is very stable and is going to come out hitting hard and hitting fast because they can. They're coming in with a lot more history, right? Okay, budget bills were filed today. So the only certainty we have, and I put this in your projection, is the golden penny yield will shift to $132.40 for next year and $140.02 for FY27. So there is a tiny amount of increase in our funding. So when I said they wanted to do $20 billion for property tax relief, the House and the Senate bills matched. They don't have the same way they want to do it, but they match in their way number $51 billion for maintaining or expanding property relief. The big difference is the Senate asked for an increase to the homestead exemption of $40,000. So if you remember, it was 25 under House Bill. No, 2 sessions ago, I start to lose my memory. It went to 40. And now it's at 100. They want to move it to $140,000. So if you think about this, if you have a home whose value is plus or minus 140, just a little bit, you wouldn't have to pay any school taxes. And in my previous district, I was in a very large district, suburban district up near me. When it went to $100,000, we lost 9,600 taxpayers off our rolls. So those homestead exemptions do have an impact on your individual taxpayers. And so the House or the Senate wants most of it to go to homestead exemption and $500 million of that to go to business reductions in taxes. They both have $400 million set aside for school safety expansion, which at this point is double what it currently is. So currently it's $10 per student and $15,000 per campus. That would double it to $20 per student and $30,000 per campus. But until it passes and until it all gets done, I wouldn't bet on that. Both versions have $1 billion in it for the ESA. However, that's just for 1 year of the biennium. It's for FY27. So if you think about that, in the next biennium, you're already starting at double that amount. You'd be at $2 billion in the next biennium if they make no changes. So that's a huge financial impact. The Senate set aside $4.1 billion for teacher pay. $10,000 would flow through for rural teachers and $4,000 for non-rural teachers, and then $750 million for a teacher incentive allotment expansion. So if your district is a member of teacher incentive allotment, it would expand. They already have $115 million set aside for the bills they have to pay under TIA. So that's a big change. And then the House leaves open the $4.85 billion for public school funding. So there's room. We expect to see some adjustment. I'm hopeful. I was hopeful last session. I'm hopeful something will happen, but until it happens, I wouldn't write any checks on it. That's the best way I know how to say it. So of the 600 bills we're tracking, so there's lots of support for these, but our system is complex. It's complex on purpose. Bills are not supposed to pass, right? We only meet every other year. And when I was thinking about it today on how I was going to present it to y'all. So the comptroller, when he did his report, he was very proud. And he said, Texas is the 8th largest economy in the world. So if you think about economies in the world, we fit 8th largest. The 8th largest economy meets every other year for 5 months to run the government. That's a lot to get done in a very short time in a very big, complex state. So our system is meant to not pass bills. So I know it's frustrating, but our system is meant to be small. And that's just the way it is. It was designed that way. It's a feature, not a bug, right? So several bills have been introduced to increase the basic allotment or index it to inflation. So I have seen bills with $50 to increase the basic allotment, which increasing the basic allotment is the fastest, simplest way to get more money in public schools. Fact. The way the system is funded, that's a fact. If you remember one thing from what I told you, increasing the basic allotment is the easiest way to get money in public schools. So $50 I've seen as low as, and I've seen it one in which I'm just convinced is like someone just being mean, increasing it the $1,500 we need to meet inflation. But there are some of those bills. Okay, there's bills to move to enrollment-based funding. If I had a magic wand, if Amber had a magic wand and could do anything she wanted, this is what I would do. Because I don't think we should punish schools for attendance of students, especially when schools are getting 94 to 96% attendance. That's 100% in my mind, So if I had my druthers, and if they ever listen to me, which they will not, it would be enrollment-based funding. There's many bills that would provide full day funding for pre-K, which I deeply appreciate because we have the early education allotment, but it only funds the second half of pre-K. So if we went to full day funding for pre-K, the early education allotment could focus on those early ed years, which would be great. Many bills increase the current allotments or create new allotments. There is a fine arts allotment for a small amount because I don't know, I didn't say this, but just FYI, we don't get any funding for fine arts, for athletics, the things that keep kids in school where they want to be there, the relationships they build with those coaches and those teachers, those aren't funded at all. So all of these are just random bills that increase special ed, they increase CTE, they increase early ed, they change how those allotments work together. So this is really important, and this is one of the more complex ones, and we wouldn't get funding next year. It would probably start in FY27, but 2 years ago or 4 now, we had a special ed committee across the state look at how special ed was funded. Because right now, like I said, the funding allotments from special ed were built in the 1980s. It's not a system that is built for 2024, right? So they want to move to an intensity of services funding, which is not, this is the room you're in. I'm in resource room. I'm in special ed 3 hours a day. It's like, no, this student receives these services and we get paid for those. So it would be a much more effective funding strategy if additional funding is provided. If they keep funding flatlined, it just changes how the funding moves. So it doesn't really cause an increase, right? It just changes how you get it. But there's lots of acknowledgement from the state that in TEA's one of the biggest tellers of the story, that special ed just is underfunded. So our funding right now, we have funding for about 10% of our students, and we're about 15% of our students are identified as special ed. That's the easiest way to explain it. It's grown, and it's growing for the right reasons, and we need to provide those funding for those services. Because what happens currently is because it's underfunded, schools have to move money from their non-special education funding to provide those services. So you're cutting general education services for students for special needs. You have to have the special needs students meet their needs. There's too many laws to not do it, but then it's hurting the other part of the system, right? So it just doesn't work mathematically. Our pie isn't getting bigger. We're just shifting how the slices are cut. And special ed just keeps taking a bigger slice, and it's becoming really difficult for public schools across the state to meet those needs. House Bill 1192 and Senate Bill 555 pay for funding for evaluations for special ed. That will be a great increase in funding for school districts because right now we don't get funded for evaluating students. So if a student is evaluated but deemed not needing services, that's just money that the district paid out. And then all of that evaluation costs, well, they still don't receive any resources until the student is in their intervention program. So evaluations are expensive and should be reimbursed. House Bill 1542 would increase the special education transportation allotment. Right now, we get $1.08 per mile. There are schools paying up as far like up to $8 a mile. So it's a system that is not working with the way it's currently funded. And something that's happened, I've seen happen over the last 5 years, is there's a lot of litigious parents in special ed. And so schools are paying a lot more in legal fees and settlements. And so House or Senate Bill 111 would put a cap on those fees that could be spent on special education proceedings and require additional reporting. This is, to me, I know there's a lot of frustration about this, but this is just facts. This is not an indictment of schools or how they're doing. This is special ed. We could spend 6 days talking about special ed by itself, and we would still all be studying at the end. It's really complicated, and it's easy for schools to get tripped up. So it's not uncommon that there are legal fees associated with special ed. So there are a number of bills that target undocumented students. House Bill 371 would remove funding for students who are undocumented. So districts could not admit students unless the federal government agreed to pay the costs, or in one of the other bills it says that they would have to educate them without funding. So in a tight fiscal climate, what would happen to students who are undocumented, right? So this becomes a really hard political statement. Many bills that provide additional tax relief. I talked about those. So there's bills out there currently that would repeal property taxes altogether. I'm not sure how our system is funded without that, but what do I know? So in several bills would fully recognize it's called a local homestead exemption. So if your district is recapture, there's some benefit to doing a local homestead exemption. So you're not collecting as much taxes, so you don't pay as much into the state for recapture. So that's just one of those accounting tricks that we can do. So the local property value study, I didn't talk about that here, but there's a whole complex system with how your local property values are assigned and how the comptroller reviews those and every other year. So there's 2 bills from Senator Hinojosa that would change how those work. And one of the benefits is sometimes if a CAD doesn't provide the correct values, a school district is penalized because they don't collect enough taxes. Because the comptroller or their local CAD didn't assign high enough value. So they get in this muck where they don't collect enough taxes and then the state ends up not giving them their local share. So they get double penalized and it's not their fault. House Bill 217 would increase the vote threshold for tax ratification elections to 60%. That's a huge change. Senate Bill 409 would prohibit districts from going to voters with a bond proposal if one had failed in the prior 5 years. So think about how many districts across the state that go out in November, it doesn't pass, and they go back out in May. You wouldn't be able to go out for 5 years. That's a long time if you have facility needs that aren't being met. And then House Bill 250 would prohibit planned defeasances, which is how you can pay down your debt early, and the adoption of disaster pennies, which a lot of us rely on. And then House Bill 929 is a weird one, but it would only allow us to, it wouldn't allow us to purchase from Buy Board, which is a really huge cooperative. So it ended up costing districts money because Buy Board is a statewide purchasing cooperative. So districts across the state use it. Well, you've got that huge volume discount. So if we lost that, there'd be it'd be not a decrease in funding, but it would be an increase in costs. So last slide on the legislature. Session began last week. We got bills today from both the House and the Senate on budget, which is a huge thing. And we'll spend the next 3 weeks picking those apart and panicking and trying to figure out what we know about them. I gave you a very high level overview today, but it's definitely high level at this point. On March 14th, we've got our 60-day deadline for bill filing. So it's going to go fast. And then on June 2nd, it's signed die and we are done with the session. So it is a very fast and furious gallop from January 14th to June 2nd to get a lot done for kids in the state of Texas. All right. Do y'all have any questions? That was a lot.
So what we normally do is I give them some time to talk at their table and come up with one question that they want to ask as a group. And then,
Perfect.
Okay, and then there are 8 tables. And so they're going to figure out what they want to ask for about the next 15 minutes. And then we will we'll ask you the questions. And any other questions that you have, you can put on the parking lot and we'll keep working on throughout the week.